Welcome back to Office Hours. It is week 5 of our edX course BE101x. We're almost two-thirds done. We finished week 4, talked a lot about tools for helping people make better decisions, and at the end of the week's content, our debate question was, should we focus as a field on developing a grand unified theory, or should we just focus on developing what I call a culture of experimentation? 5 panelists that actually spoke on our video on the debate. John Lynch, professor at the University of Colorado, basically sort of acknowledged the difficulty in coming up with a grand theory. In fact, he said it needn't be a grand theory, but I quote an interesting point he made at the end: if we don't have a theory and we are just experimenting, then we don't do what we are supposed to do as academics. The goal of academia is to try and understand theoretically what drives behavior. The other interesting point he made was having a theory guides us towards practice. Knowing what we are going to test and knowing why those particular effects are going to happen tells us a little bit more about where we should be trying to intervene and find nudges. So interesting perspective there. Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy in the United Kingdom again sort of presented arguments for both having a theory and not. And he made an interesting point. He said, now just because we will never have a perfect theory doesn't mean that we should stop trying. So the desire to push for a good theory is still something that echoed loudly through his comments, but he did sort of seem to make the point that you at this point in time need to think through a culture of experimentation and of empiricism, because that's what's going to give us the data that will eventually help us with building a grand theory. Again, that point was made by Darren Dahl, professor at the University of British Columbia. It's a complex topic, is what he said. Decision making is a complex field. Everything matters, as we've said so many times, and so to have a theory of everything is a challenge. So he thinks we'll get there eventually, but it's going to be a long and slow haul, and the best way we prepare ourselves to develop that theory is the idea of experimentation. Again, interesting comment Darren made. He called judgment and decision making a living science, which I think is interesting, because every couple of months we are learning new things about how people make choices, as it will. Professor Chris Shee, who we've seen before from the University of Chicago, had an interesting counter question. Why do we need a grand theory? And not in his words, but one of the points he was getting to is that if our goal is to create nudges that help make the world a better place, and those nudges are going to affect decision making that is tied to a given context, shouldn't we just be contextual and study empirically what's happening in that particular context? So he said, maybe there isn't a grand theory, maybe we don't need a grand theory, and maybe it's just an illusion that there is a grand theory, and maybe Chris is right. And then finally we had my colleague Professor Chenbo Zhang from the Rotman School at the University of Toronto, who talked about sort of this tussle between theory and empiricism, or theory and experimentation, as a topic that's being discussed and debated hotly, not just in this forum here, but in the field of psychology more generally. And he's more excited with the idea of testing hypotheses through experimentation and through building a culture of empiricism. So again, we saw this is a different debate at many levels, because unlike the previous debates where we saw our panels taking sides, here most people were sort of somewhere in the middle, saying that we want a theory, but it's not clear that we're going to get that theory any soon. A couple of people saying let's just focus on experiments. So what did BE101x think? Let's go back and take a quick look. So in many ways, your comments were consistent with what the panel was suggesting. The idea that theory is important. But again, from a practical perspective, I think it is important for us as organizations, as individuals, as not-for-profits, as entities trying to influence behavior, in particular for welfare, that we build the tools to make our organizations smart in terms of developing that culture of experimentation. And we talked in the lectures about what it means to be an experimental organization, the ability to go quickly collect samples, isolate subsamples, run quick tests, get feedback, iterate, and then go back and test. And so that is for me a critical skill at this point in time, in particular for those of us who are in the field and trying to influence people's behavior. There are obviously going to be universities and labs that specialize on theory development that will focus on the theory aspect. But I do think that not all of us need to be specialists. We don't need to be in a world where everybody's developing theory or everybody's developing empirical skills. We can specialize, and I think that's really the way we think about knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. Is I think it's the role of a university to develop the insights, and I agree with John Lynch, who said that if we didn't do that, if we didn't develop theory, we wouldn't be scientists. But we also need to then translate that theory into practical, actionable insights, and make sure we build that culture of experimentation at the grassroots, where we are actually doing evidence-based policy. We are doing evidence-based welfare delivery systems. We are doing evidence-based consumer service, and so on and so forth. We talk a lot about doing evidence-based work, but we aren't very good as a society at collecting scientific evidence. And so hopefully the ideas we talked about last week, the notion of control experiments, the notion of different kinds of designs, dependent variables, how you analyze those variables, will push some of you into embedding those stories, those principles, those ideas into your organizations, and developing that culture where all decisions are made based on evidence. That evidence could come from the lab, as we talked about earlier. It could come from the field. The evidence could come from before-after designs. It could come from designs that are more complex. But again, as we said, the principle of triangulation tells us that the more evidence you collect, the better off we become. We should develop that culture of evidence-based management. The other thing that's important is we need to be able to design mechanisms where we can share our empirical results easily, quickly, and reliably. I think a lot of us end up reinventing the wheel in terms of taking ideas and making them work, and we need to do that simply because we don't know what other people have done. So imagine a worldwide database where anybody who does an experiment, let's say using anchoring and adjustment or defaults, logs in the results, and anyone in the world can actually access those results. We now have a menu out there where we know what other people have tried, what's worked, what's not, and having that evidence at hand, I think, would make a big difference. So if anybody out there is looking for an interesting project, think about creating that database. Think about creating a platform where researchers, practitioners, policymakers, welfare architects from all over the world can actually go in and log their findings and log the results. That would be a great contribution to the field of behavioral economics. And lastly, if that data is made available to people in academia, people whose business it is to create the theory, I think that makes things easier for us in terms of theory development. Remember last time we talked about the notion of discovery versus theory testing. If we had access to more data on the discovery phase, I think it becomes easier to let academics focus on theory testing. And I think it just makes the entire system more efficient. So again, if you can build that culture of experimentation, if we can figure out device ways in which those results, those data can be shared quickly and easily and seamlessly across countries and organizations and entities, I think the world would definitely be a better place. If not a better place, at least a more empirically informed place. Thank you again for all of your contributions. I will see you back next week with the debate for week 5.